Some other journalists and some other analysts says, and even President Lula says uh, that has good relationship with George Bush, a
Yeah,
former Republican, that
right.
guy who started everything in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yes.
And some analysts says that Obama and Biden are worst for the rest of the world than the Republicans. What do you think about this?
I actually think there's something to that.
Mhm.
Uh, everybody liked George W. Bush as a person. Not everybody liked him as a president, but I think many Americans realized that he wasn't really the president, that Dick Cheney was really the president. Um, but by all accounts, and you'll hear this from both Republicans and Democrats, George W. Bush was a nice guy. He was somebody that you would want to go out and drink a beer with. Uh, Barack Obama, not so much. I'm biased against Obama because I thought Obama sold out to the national security state. It was Obama that prosecuted 8 national security whistleblowers and put all of us in prison. That's 3 times as many as all previous American presidents combined. Uh, and uh, and Joe Biden is an extension of the Obama White House and the Obama foreign policy. And it's not even as good as the Obama foreign policy. At least Obama had opened relations with Cuba. And
Yes.
Joe Biden has not reopened the relations with Cuba that were closed during the Trump administration. So, how crazy is it that all these years later, we're looking back and saying, oh, I miss the good old days of George W. Bush. It's crazy to even think, but that's where we've arrived. And let me tell you one other thing. In the
Okay.
halls at the CIA during the George W. Bush administration, we used to marvel at how hard that State Department worked to not talk to our enemies. Like if you're in the State Department, if you're a diplomat, your job is to carry out diplomacy. Your job is to talk to everybody. Your job is to put forth American foreign policy goals. And they worked very hard to not talk to our enemies, to not engage in diplomacy. As you said, it was George W. Bush that launched the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. But then we have Saint Obama, who becomes president, and all of a sudden we're fighting in Syria, we're fighting in Libya, we're fighting in Somalia, we're still fighting in Iraq, we're still fighting in Afghanistan. Well, what's the difference? It was
And we
even
killed Bin
worse.
Laden, and there's
Yeah, exactly.
nothing changes.
Nothing changed. Exactly. It was
Yeah.
very disappointing.
Yeah. Another question related to war in Ukraine. The Washington Post said that U.S. spy agencies pick up intelligence in mid-June, indicating that Wagner mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin was planning an armed action against the Russian defense establishment.
Mhm.
Is this possible that the CIA is helping Prigozhin or the Russian mercenaries?
It's possible, certainly. I'll tell you, if the war were not taking place right now, what would have likely happened is the CIA would have warned President Putin that something was afoot. This has happened twice in the past, where NSA or the CIA picked up intelligence that there were legitimate threats to the Russian government. And so President George H.W. Bush at one point warned President Gorbachev that there was going to be a coup attempt against him. And Gorbachev was able to kill this coup before it took place. And then a few years later, the CIA picked up intelligence that there was going to be a coup attempt against President Yeltsin. And they warned Yeltsin in advance so that he could respond. So there's a precedent for warning the president of Russia that something is afoot. They did not warn him this time. And I would have to assume that this news came from a leak from the CIA. So it's certainly possible that the CIA either was assisting the Wagner group in some way or decided just to stay out of it because any attempt to move on Moscow would weaken Putin, and the CIA wants Putin to be weakened.
Wants Putin to get weakened, but the coup didn't prospect at this time. What do you
Right.
think it's happening?
I think Prigozhin overplayed his hand very badly. You know, Prigozhin said in the last few days that he had 25,000 men that were willing to move on Moscow. That just wasn't true. It was more like 2,500 men or 3,000 men. And, you know, he said that he had taken the town of Rostov-on-Don. That also wasn't true. He had taken control of one military base in Rostov. He just didn't have the backing to support his rhetoric and his threats. And then when he received his call from President Lukashenko saying that Lukashenko had spoken with Putin and Putin was willing to allow Prigozhin to go into exile in Belarus, he took that out. But I think that what we would have seen had he continued on to Moscow would have been a bloodbath.
Totally. There is another question about this case. Rebecca Kufler, an ex-CIA analyst, has claimed that Vladimir Putin orchestrated the coup with Wagner mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin in a classic false flag to try to make the West believe his army had weakened. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. He doesn't need to convince the West of anything. The West is going to be convinced one way or the other based on what's happening on the battlefield. You know, this is a problem that I have with a lot of CIA analysts or former CIA analysts, is that everything's a false flag. Well, you know how complicated false flags are? You know how many moving parts there are in a false flag where everything has to go exactly according to plan for it to actually work? Listen, after 15 years at the CIA, I could tell you there are a lot of stupid people at the CIA. There are a lot of people who have no idea what they're doing. There are a lot of people who just are not equipped to think over the course of the long term. Plus, the CIA, like any big organization, is a slow, bureaucratic kind of organization. They're not able to make decisions quickly to make these kinds of things happen. So no, I'm not a believer in the false flag narrative.